given social media and advances in technology, then how is this going to change the transmission of emotion concepts in future generations? Or what are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. So I hope that it will. But here's my worry a little bit is that right now, actually, we have a paper coming out in a journal called Psychological Science in the Public Interest. And this is an APS journal that is designed to take on big questions and write basically like a white paper, like a position paper. And the authors of these papers are always negotiated with the editorial boards. You have to have, we just did one on facial expressions, for example. And it has to be a diverse authorship board. So the authorship team has to be diverse. They all have to, if there's a debate, you have to have members of both sides of a debate. In our case, there were like 3 or 4 different, it was like a cube, but we had 5, there were 5 of us actually. And we met, it's all senior people, very senior people. We met weekly for like 2 years over Zoom. We read, I would say, well over 1,000 papers, and just covered every conceivable literature that would be relevant to test the question of whether or not there are universal expressions of emotion. And the answer is no, there aren't. Which doesn't mean that what your face is doing is random. But certainly there are companies that believe that there's a lot of like emotion technology that's being built on the assumption that a scowl is always anger and or even frequently anger, an expression of anger, and that a smile is frequently an expression of sadness and so on. And they don't make a distinction between the movements on the face and the inference of its emotional meaning or its social meaning. And so one of the worries about social media is that it's not that there's increased diversity in the concepts and categories of emotion or meaning that it's given to physical configurations of movement of the face and the body. It's that there's scientific imperialism where we tell everybody around the world, look, a scowl is anger because Americans say that a scowl is anger. Because Darwin said that a scowl was anger. Actually, it wasn't really Darwin, it was Duchenne, but whatever. Darwin published it in his book. So, Darwin said it, therefore it must be true. Actually, that is happening with social media and with a lot of the... even sometimes with experiments where you go to a culture and without realizing it, the way that your experiment is designed is actually teaching subjects what the right answer is. And we have a paper coming out actually about this exact thing where we demonstrated you can take any set of expressions for any set of concepts that are not universal and you can dump them into a particular experimental method and make them look universal really easily. Because you're teaching people the meaning of that facial configuration in a really like shallow way, but in a quick way. So I hope that there actually is cross-pollination, because I think it would be really interesting, not just as a scientist, actually. I mean, I think as a person, it would be really interesting if that were true. And it might actually cut down on, some of the great mistakes that have occurred both within a government and sometimes even between governments have been made because people have misread they've inferred incorrectly the emotional meaning of a tone of voice or a set of facial movements or so on and so forth. But the other side is also possible, right? That as people import American culture, they also import American cultural artifacts, some of which are the stereotypes for expressions. And the tricky bit is that not even Americans behave in a way that is consistent with those stereotypes for the most part. That's what the data suggests. So it's exciting, but also maybe sort of also a little concerning.
Yeah. How do we then reconcile this old literature based on the basic emotion method, which you talk a lot about in the earlier chapters of your book, reconcile that with the theory of constructed emotion, which you're proposing? How do we reconcile those two literatures so that we can move forward? And
so here's what I think the way not to do it is to have a gotcha moment. Like, well, you guys used a shitty method and now look at the mess you got us into, which I think people are tempted to do. And I really would not do it, because I look at that literature and I say, well, how is it that what are the active ingredients in that method where you can go to Tanzania to, Hadza, hunter-gatherers, and you can have them basically do a face, like an emotion perception task, and perform like an American subject? What is really powerful in those methods, in that method that lets you do that? And the answer is words. You're basically, what you're doing is, with words, you are teaching a concept. It's a shallow concept. It's shallow teaching. We don't know how long it would last for. We don't know how, if you used really variable exemplars, would it, we don't, there's so many things but I think that, again, you could talk about this as a confound, or you can say what I said to Paul Ekman, which is, listen, I'm never going to say that you discovered nothing and that everything you've done in your life's work is shit. I am going to say that I think you discovered really something important. It's just not what you think you discovered. So I think actually in that literature, you can take apart that method piece by piece, and you can see what the active ingredients are. Of course, they have a synergy working together, the active ingredients in the method, but one of the active ingredients is you have to have words. You have to have words for emotion. If you don't have words, even with Americans, right? If you take Americans who've never taken a psych course, so they've never taken a psychology course, so they've never seen those scowls and smiles and pouts and so on, with words underneath them. And they've never done any kind of like emotional literacy stuff, right? And you just give them the faces and you say, tell me what's going on with this person. You do not see, the 6 so-called basic universal expressions. If you don't even ask people to label them, you go, just sort them into piles where everyone in the pile's feeling the same thing. They give you 14 piles, 16 piles, 11 piles. If you give them 6 identities making the 6, stereotyped expressions. But if you give it to a psych student, if you give it to somebody who studies emotional literacy, boom, 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 6 piles. So what's happening here is that we are teaching people the categories that we think that we're discovering. And that's the lesson, I think. There are other lessons too, like they're hugely impoverished stimuli, and because basically these are studies where you show someone a face and you give them 2 words and you say, which of these 2 words matches that face? And the faces are, even though to us it feels like we are focusing on each other's faces, our brains are actually obviously capturing an entire sensory array, including what's going on in our own bodies in that moment. But we are consciously and with great awareness paying attention to a particular face. So we think that's where all the information is. And I was just saying, I think I was saying this to Mike this morning, that, neuroscientists make a lot of noise about doing objective science. But as much as anybody, I think I'm going to say we, just to soften the blow a little, include myself here, even though I don't really think I do this, but I'm sure I do it sometimes, are using common sense categories. They're not aware of their bodies, so they think the environment is everything exteroceptive, but not the body, when in fact you carry around your own personal context with you everywhere you go, right? You have an awareness of looking at someone's face, and so you think, well, that's where all the information is, because, that's where my attention is focused, even though your brain is actually capturing patterns, ensembles, right? It's doing statistical learning across patterns, and so on and so forth. So I definitely think that the findings of the basic emotion approach have value All data has value. You just have to figure out for what.
Okay, thank you.